Hello everyone, my name is Tian Zhao, and I'm from the Department of Civil Environmental Engineering at MIT. And today I'm going to introduce my research on the influence of vegetation-generated turbulence on bedload sediment transport. And I'll focus on the role of stem diameter. Aquatic vegetation is a crucial wetland component. It protects river banks and coasts against flood events, and it also provides shelter for various biological communities, such as crabs and cranes. However, wetland is being lost at an annual rate of 0.7 to 7% globally. And in order to preserve the wetland, sediment retention is required, which calls for a deeper understanding of sediment transport. So, how does aquatic vegetation influence sediment transport? Aquatic vegetation first influences both the mean and turbulent velocities. On the one hand, vegetation elements pose drag against the flow that reduces downstream velocity and enables sediment deposition. But on the other hand, vegetation can also generate turbulence that facilitates sediment transport and erosion. So appropriate distribution of vegetation can adjust flow and sediment transport and therefore eliminate erosion and stabilize the wetland. So how can we quantify sediment transport within the vegetation canopies? Here are two figures where the dimensionless sediment transport rate, QS star, is plotted against the dimensionless bed shear stress, tau star, and the dimensionless turbulent kinetic energy, KT star, respectively. For many years, the bed shear stress-based models were successful in predicting bedload sediment transport in open channels without vegetation. But in channels with vegetation, vegetation generates additional turbulence that can enhance sediment transport, which was not included in the measured shear stress. So this significantly underestimated the sediment transport rate in vegetated channels. However, if we incorporate the effects of vegetation in the channel averaged energy of turbulence here, then all the data points will collapse onto a single curve, suggesting that the sediment transport rate can be better described as a function of KT, TKE. So how can we predict TKE within vegetation? Based on energy balance, Tonino and Neff described the dimensionless turbulent kinetic energy, which is the ratio of the square root of KT to the channel average velocity, as a function of the form drag coefficient of cylinders, the ratio of turbulence length scale to the stem diameter, and also the solid volume fraction. So they assumed the length scale of turbulence is proportional to the stem diameter. But only a single diameter was tested in their experiments. And because the stem diameter varies between species and by the growth phase of vegetation, to validate this model, we would like to explore if larger stems create larger turbulent eddies. And what if we have an array of mixed diameter cylinders? Okay, so let's assume that the Tonino model works. So how does turbulence influence bedload sediment transport? Here is an interesting study that shows both the force magnitude and duration dictate particle dislodgement. The first figure is the time series of flow velocity squared, representing the hydrodynamic force on that sediment, which is proportional to the TKE. The second figure is the time series of impulse, that is the force integral over time. And the third figure represents particle dislodgement events, represented by these peaks. And these figures show that for particle dislodgement, the force magnitude first must exceed a critical value. But that's not enough. The force duration also has to be sufficiently long so that the impulse can accumulate and exceed the threshold. And therefore, we see grain dislodgement. Here, the force duration is proportional to the ratio of the eddy size to the flow velocity. So does that mean larger stems generate larger eddies and promote more sediment transport? Well, there's another possibility, because at the same solid volume fraction, larger stems would generate fewer eddies. So how does this influence bedload transport? Let's consider two different cases with the same TKE, but different stem diameters. And by attributing the TKE to the dominant energy-containing eddies with the length scale lambda, and consider the velocity fluctuation below. So here, the figure below represents the square of velocity fluctuation associated with the turbulence scale lambda. In order to initiate bedload sediment transport, the hydrodynamic force represented by U prime square must exceed this threshold represented by the dashed line here, UCR prime square, so that its impulse can accumulate as illustrated by the colored bands. Here, delta t represents the duration that the impulse accumulates within a single turbulence event. So for case 1, we have smaller stem diameter, which yields shorter duration, but within a given period of time, we have more frequent events. While in case 2, we have larger stem diameter, which corresponds to longer duration, but less frequent events within this specific period of time. So eventually, we will have the same total impulse for sediment transport. And that implies that the sediment transport may not depend on the stem diameter. So to test my hypothesis, here's my experimental setup. So in my experiments, I use rigid emergent cylinders, which means they're not flexible and they're higher than the flow depth. And here's the photograph and top wheel of the first set of experiments focusing on the turbulence length scale without sediment. And this flow measurement pattern was used to accurately capture the channel turbulence. And here are my choices of stem diameter and solid volume fraction values. And in the second set of experiments, I worked in a flume that recirculates both the water and sediment. And I measure the flow and turbulence within the unit cell that represents the channel average value. And again, here are my choices of stem diameter and solid volume fraction values. So what I found is that first, the eddy size is proportional to the stem diameter. And if we have an array of mixed stem size, then the eddy size would be proportional to the arithmetic mean of all the stem diameters. Here, I use different colors to represent different stem diameters. And that is a basic assumption embedded in the Tonino and Neff model. So we have validated this model, and we expect it to work for all of my cases. And yes, it worked. So here the blue band represents the 95% confidence interval of the Tonino and Neff model, where in this figure, I plotted the dimensionless turbulent kinetic energy against the solid volume fraction. And here, again, I use different colors to represent different diameters. And we considered a wide range of stem diameters ranging from 0.6 centimeter to 5.1 centimeters. And from this figure, we conclude that the TKE was not strongly dependent on the stem diameter, and it can be predicted from the solid volume fraction here. So, if we have a larger stem diameter, we won't see too much change in the TKE. But how about the sediment transport? Well, sediment transport did not depend on the stem diameter at the same turbulent kinetic energy level. So in this figure, I plotted the sediment transport rate versus the channel average TKE. And here the black line represents the approximate resolution of the experiments. And for the same TKE, we don't see a clear dependence of the sediment transport rate on the stem diameter. So in conclusion, first, larger stems create larger turbulent eddies, and in a mixed cylinder array, turbulence scales with the arithmetic mean diameter. And second, for the same solid volume fraction, the stem diameter does not significantly influence the turbulent kinetic energy. And also for the same solid volume fraction, the cumulative impulse for different stem diameters is comparable, therefore generating similar sediment transport rates. And these results imply that the solid volume fraction controls bedload transport. Is this still true for plants with more complex morphology like Spartina? Well, that would be my next step. Thank you for your attention.